With all the wrangling that is going on in Washington, D.C. and in Congress, if you ever said to yourself, it would sure be nice to get the perspective of someone who is really knowledgeable about this, but not currently involved. I'm sure you're going to appreciate today's speaker, our own Brian Baird. Who better to offer perspective about that? Brian served 12 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, including serving much of this, his district serving much of this area, including Thurston County. As a member of the House, he focused on science and technology, energy, healthcare, especially mental health, oceans, foreign policy, fiscal discipline, and congressional integrity. As a congressman, Brian was known and respected for taking principled stands, careful study of the issues, and building bipartisan relationships. He's currently working on a book emanating from his experience. I'm sure you'll hear more about that during his remarks. In addition to his work in Congress, Brian holds a PhD in clinical psychology with a license to practice in Washington State. In addition to more than 2 decades of clinical work, Brian previously served as chair of the Department of Psychology for Pacific Lutheran University and is the author of 3 books. Brian currently lives in Edmonds with his wife and their 2 6-year-old boys. Please welcome our own Brian Baird.
Well, it's great to be back at Olympia, Dick. Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation. President Riley, thanks for your work. I want to start by thanking Rotary for the obviously good work you've done here in the local community, but also share 2 things. One, I have often said, and I firmly believe, that the country would be in a better place if Congress began each day with the 4-way pledge and took it seriously, especially right now. Imagine if people seriously began and then introspected about, am I conducting myself in a fashion consistent with that, which is not what we often see back there, I'm afraid. But I also want to share with you a real positive anecdote. I was in Cairo, Egypt about 2 years ago, and one of the things you find when you travel around the world, I'm sure you've all found this, is you find Rotary or Rotarians everywhere you go and doing good things. The number of international leaders and business people, etc., that I met are just like these young ladies who came to America at some point in their life and on a Rotary scholarship or a Rotary exchange of some kind. But in Cairo, Egypt, the garbage collection for many, many years was done by Coptic Christians. And they were an oppressed religious minority. They were left basically, that is how they fended for themselves, and they took the garbage and fed it to their pigs, and because they were not Muslim, they could raise pigs, and they survived at sort of the lower rungs of society. Rotary and some well-intentioned and bright people among the Coptic group began to turn that enterprise into a way to educate the kids. They began to take fabric and weave rugs. They began to take paper and recycle it to make wrapping paper. They began to do all sorts of creative ways to use what had been a bottom-tier profession and group to elevate their kids. And it was such a privilege to tour that site with Ambassador Scobie and with the proud Rotarians who had made it happen. And I will share that story with you because it would be nice if occasionally our media would have a special section that would be just called Reasons for Hope. Reasons for Hope, because we always hear the horrific things. And around the world, you should be proud that many of the reasons for hope, and there are many, are connected to your organization. And I want to thank you for that and commend you for that work. And I'm very impressed and grateful for the work Rotary does. I want to today talk a little bit about a book I wrote that I wrote for about 5 years. It wasn't something I just did at the end of the time in Congress, and then opened up for some discussion and questions. And the advantage is I'm not running for anything, so this is actually kind of fun. So over the years, when issues come up, one says, okay, you've got the legislation that is before you, but you also have a right and a responsibility, I think, to say, so what would I do if I could do it the way I would like to do it, the way I think is the right thing to do. So whether the topic is energy policy, healthcare, education, defense, you name it, the economy, you can look at that problem and say, what can we do? And I began to work on this book with the premise of what if we could do two things. One, be absolutely fearless in terms of not worrying about political consequences at all, not worrying about what a poll would say, not worrying about a special interest group, not worrying about campaign contributions, not worrying about the ever-present attack ad. Just tell the truth as you best see it. And then two, be willing to look with very fresh eyes at policy. In other words, take the tax code, for example, 20,000 pages long right now, or more. Nobody understands all of it. And most of reforms tend to actually make it more complicated. And I'm a big believer that we need to simplify things. And so what would we do, or what are some alternative ways of approaching, for example, taxes, or healthcare, or energy, etc., if we didn't have to start with the baggage that was there, and we didn't live in fear of attack ads and somebody saying, I'm not going to contribute to you anymore. The other element of this book was that I came to realize over, many of you share this, and I think it's central to Rotary's credo and its way of being. Policy is one thing, but at the end of the day, the best policies on paper won't mean anything if you don't start with character. Character in the people who represent you, and character in the people themselves. And we never talk about that. If you look at most political books, or speeches for that matter, we always talk about what are we going to do for healthcare, what do we do with education, etc. And I've come to believe that if we don't focus a good bit on character, and by that I mean fundamental qualities like honesty. I mean real honesty. Honesty's hard, but real honesty. Honesty about our own shortcomings, honesty about objective information, honesty about facts as we understand them. Integrity, the ability and willingness to conduct ourselves consistent with our values and consistent with our honesty. One thing to hold a value. Values, you hear about values voters. That's easy. I value this. Well, is our behavior consistent with our values? That's much more difficult. Courage, because it takes courage to speak truth and to say difficult and do even more courage to do difficult things. A sense of community, that there's something much greater than ourselves out there. And finally, humility. By that I mean the sense that we are not the sole possessor of all good ideas. There are good ideas on both sides. There are bad ideas on our own side. And being willing and able to look at things rather objectively and with a willingness to respect other people's ideas. So that's the premise of the book. The book's called Character, Politics, and Responsibility. And what it does is it begins with the budget, and then it moves through the budget, the deficit, and the debt, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then it moves through key policies of education, healthcare, energy, the economy, foreign policy, and government reform. I'll start with the deficit, and we won't cover all that today, don't worry, and there will be no quiz. But I had the privilege of serving on the House Budget Committee for 6 years. It's a term-limited position, at least on the Democratic side was at the time. And the reason it was term-limited was because your antidepressant medications prescription ran out after 6 years. And so they realized that it would be a devastating psychological impact. And so as your prescription runs out, then you get off the committee and you can move on. But in that capacity, I continually hammered away at both sides about this issue of the debt, which is now central to much of the debate that you follow today. And the short, brief statement is this. Neither side has been fully honest, because the numbers are just horrifying. The numbers are, here's the size of the deficit. The debt is over 14 trillion. The deficit's over 1.5 trillion. And that is driven by a variety of factors: wars, tax cuts, and entitlement spending together, and downturn in the economy. All of that together, and a bunch of other things. But the solution, I believe, and I think mathematics just is convincing in this, is going to take something no politician wants on either side to say. You're going to have to cut spending, including entitlements, which means Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, etc. You're going to have to increase taxes. I personally believe that should be on everybody, not just the super wealthy, because we all are in this together. And you're going to have to